The night the raiders came, the moon lowered its gaze. Goats scattered like torn pearls over the hillside, bells clattering as if to summon help that would never arrive. Smoke rose in columns from the village below, and the wind that once smelled of thyme carried iron and ash. She was 14 when the rope found her wrists. By morning, her childhood was a smudge on the horizon behind a caravan that did not look back. They called her Sass because a matron in the market said the name sounded nimble, easy on the tongue of a buyer. She did not answer at first. Answering made it real. She kept her old name inside her like an ember that would either keep her warm or burn her from within. On the third day, one of the guards joked that stubborn horses fetch a lower price. She answered then. In the calculus of survival, sometimes the smallest betrayals save a life. Istanbul rose from the Bosphorus like a second sky, domes stacking upon domes, minarets pinning the clouds to the blue. The Topkapi walls were white in the afternoon glare, a geometry of power that made her feel the shape of her own smallness. At the gate of felicity they were counted, weighed, inspected. Hands turned her chin left and right. A bit of resin was rubbed on her teeth to test their strength. A woman with ink-stained fingers noted, sound joints, no pock scars, and snapped the ledger shut as if closing the lid on any other future. Her first day in the palace smelled of lavender and lye. The hammam steamed like a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Attendants scraped her skin until the past came off in rolls. She bit the inside of her cheek and tasted copper, refusing the tears that would please them. When they left her alone, she pressed her forehead to the marble and tried to hear through the stone. Footsteps of others, whispers sewn into its pores. She felt less alone when she believed the walls remembered. They cut her hair to the shoulders and dressed her in cotton as clean as a lie. You are a semi-kuz now. Novice, said a woman called the Hazindar, keeper of treasures, whose eyes were sharp enough to slice silk. You will be taught to move as if someone is always watching because someone always is. You will learn Turkish without a village in your mouth. You will learn the prayers and say them with your whole body. Your safety depends upon your obedience and your invisibility. Do you understand? Sass nodded. In the market, value was measured in coin. Here, it would be measured in mistakes not made. The dormitory held 20 girls arranged like books on a shelf. An Albanian who carved birds from crumbs of bread. A Circassian who carried a scar beneath her collarbone like a comma. A Tatar girl who played songs on a reed flute until the matrons forbade it, declaring music a door that swung too easily to memory. By candlelight, they shared words for river, for mother, for home. They compared the shapes of sorrow. Sorrow, Sass learned, was a tongue everyone spoke. Mornings began before the first prayer, when the sky was a bruise fading toward day. They learned to pour sherbet without a ripple, to embroider patience into sleeves, to keep their eyes low but their attention wide, to serve without spilling themselves. The Valide Sultan, Nurbanu, never raised her voice. She did not need to. Power in the harem moved like water. It flooded the low places and cut canyons without noise. Under Nurbanu there were layers, the Haseki, the Kadans, the favorites, the hopefuls. Each layer pressed upon the one beneath until the bottom carried the weight of a world that would never know it. Sass's closest teacher was Gulsum Hatun, a senior Kalfa whose hands smelled of rose attar and ink. Gulsum was round, quick, and practical, a seamstress of events who stitched outcomes where she needed them. Grace is not softness, she told Sass one afternoon while adjusting a sash. Grace is control that looks like water. Do you know what happens to water when it meets a rock? Sass thought of the stream near her village, how it had chattered itself into foam against a stubborn boulder. It goes around, she said. It smooths the rock in time. Gulsum smiled. That is our patience. There were rules that felt like barricades and rules that felt like bridges. They were not the same rules every day. In this, too, was instruction. Sass learned to memorize the faces of the eunuchs, particularly the Kızlar Ağa, the chief, whose eyes were the color of prunes and twice as wrinkled. He walked as if friction did not apply to him, and his voice could bless or blight in equal measure. When he passed, girls straightened like strings tuned up by the touch of his shadow. Weeks turned to months, months to years. Sass grew into her bones and her silence. When she laughed, which was rarely, it escaped like a bird that had slipped some careless latch. Her Turkish became the language of her thoughts. Sometimes she would wake and have to translate her dreams back into her mother tongue in order to remember them. This frightened her more than the guards had. Forgetting was a slow murder, but it felt like mercy while it worked. They say cities never sleep, but some nights even the city seems to hold its breath. I remember one such night, when the rain poured like memories trying to wash away everything we once were. That was the night she left, and the second time the rain fell, it wasn't from the sky. It was from my eyes. Her name was Emily Carter. The first time I saw her, she was standing outside a small coffee shop on Fifth Avenue, hair tied in a messy bun, tapping her cup to the rhythm of a song only she could hear. She looked like chaos wrapped in calm, and somehow that combination pulled me in. I was working as a freelance photographer then, hunting faces that told stories. Hers didn't just tell a story, it whispered one I wanted to live. I remember raising my camera, capturing her through the fogged-up window. She caught me, smiled and mouthed, "Delete it." I didn't. Instead, I walked inside, ordered a black coffee I never drank, and said, "If I delete it, the world will miss its best picture." She laughed, a short, nervous laugh, and said, "Then make sure you capture it right." That's how it started. Two people with no reason to meet, crossing paths because life sometimes writes better scripts than we do. For months, our days became a pattern of coffee, rain, and late-night walks. Emily was studying literature. She had this habit of carrying old poetry books in her bag, pages highlighted and corners folded. She believed people were like chapters, some short, some long, some that end without closure. I told her I wanted to be the last page of her favorite book. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't read, something that looked like goodbye waiting to happen. I thought it was just fear, hers or mine, I wasn't sure. Life felt perfect for a while. We moved into a small apartment downtown, 2 rooms, 1 dream. She painted the walls with pastel colors. I filled them with photographs. Every morning she'd leave sticky notes on the fridge, quotes, jokes, sometimes just a heart drawn in blue ink. We were building something fragile but beautiful, like a paper boat floating on uncertain water. Then came the first storm. It was a Tuesday. I had been gone all day shooting a wedding gig outside the city. When I came back, the apartment lights were dim, and Emily was sitting on the couch, clutching her stomach, pale and trembling. Hospital lights replaced the warmth of our room that night. Doctors spoke in words that hit like quiet bullets. Internal bleeding. Rare condition. Long-term treatment. Emily tried to smile through the pain. "Looks like I'll have more time to read now," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to joke, told her I'd build a library around her bed, but inside, I was drowning in a silence I couldn't photograph. The weeks that followed felt like months, treatments, bills, and the slow fading of her laughter. I picked up more photography gigs, worked late nights, skipped meals, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through my fingers. She'd watch me from the bed, whispering, "You don't have to fix everything, Daniel. Sometimes love means just being there." But I couldn't just be there. I needed to fight for her. That's what love meant to me. One evening, when she was strong enough to walk, we went to the pier. The sun was melting into the ocean, turning everything gold. She leaned on the railing and said, "Promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't photograph sunsets for a while. I don't want you to see beauty and remember pain." I laughed nervously. "You're not going anywhere, Emily." She looked at me with those same unreadable eyes and whispered, "Every story ends, Daniel. Just make sure ours is remembered kindly." I didn't sleep that night. I watched her breathe, counted every rise and fall of her chest, terrified one of them would be the last. Months passed. Some days were good, others worse. She lost weight, lost strength, but never lost her strange humor. Once, when her hair started falling because of medication, she said, "Guess I'll finally see if blondes have more fun." I laughed until I cried. Then came winter, the season she always said she loved. Snow painted the city white, and for a moment it looked pure again. We celebrated Christmas in the hospital. I brought her fairy lights and hung them around her bed. She said it looked like stars had come down to keep her company. That night she asked me to read her favorite poem. I remember every line. Maybe love doesn't need forever, it just needs to happen once, and happen deeply enough to echo when we're gone. Her rival arrived on the tail of a storm. The new girl's name was Ziba, though on her first day she answered to none of the names offered. Ziba's beauty was the sort that made rooms rearrange themselves. The matrons exchanged glances measured in needle pricks. The rules began to tilt toward Ziba without appearing to move at all. Sas, who had learned to read the air, noticed how favors condensed around the newcomer like dew. It was Gulsum who first warned her. "The garden grows many roses," she said, drawing her needle through silk. "Some open at dawn, some at noon. The sun is one, but not its angles." Sas understood. The Sultan, whom they knew by directives and rumors rather than by breath, was a man the way winds are directions. Where he looked, careers sprouted. Where he did not, you could starve in plain sight. Still, survival is not merely the absence of death. It is the presence of something to live for. Sas found hers in the schoolroom where younger novices squinted over their letters. She traced Arabic across slate with a patience she could not give herself. The littlest ones clung to the edges of her skirt, as if fabric could anchor them. She told them stories of gardens where no gate locked from the inside and promised them that words were keys. She believed it as she said it, for belief is also a key, and sometimes the only one at hand. When Nurbanu Valide Sultan fell ill, the harem held its breath like a single body. For days the corridors smelled faintly of saffron and something metallic. Women walked as if their steps might decide outcomes. The chief eunuch's beads clicked like an abacus no one else could see. Sas delivered rosewater to a room where she was not allowed to look. She kept her gaze trained on the tray, which trembled only very slightly. Rumors braided themselves into ropes and swung across courtyards, that the Valid had named a successor among the Khadans, that the Haseki herself might be diminished, that the Sultan had taken to solitude, that a prince favored by one faction or another would soon be named to some governorship too far or too near. Ziba, who had quickly become a favorite, wore her worry like ornament. It suited her. She had a way of making her fears look like invitations. Sas watched how men and women were drawn to mend in her what they believed was broken, and how that made them useful to her. It was a skill, and Sas took its measure without envy. Envy was a knife with no handle. She had learned not to pick it up. The night the Valid died, there were no wails, only a silence so profound it rearranged the air. Lamps burned low, and shadows lengthened as if mourning too. Rituals unfurled, ablutions, prayers, the careful sequence of a power's departure. In the women's quarters, a hush gave way to a calculation. In the men's, to a different one. The palace did not stop. The palace never stops. But it shifted, quietly and forever, and those sensitive to pressure felt the change in their joints. What followed were months of smaller storms. In the absence of one gravity, many smaller gravities asserted themselves. The Haseki sought to gather the threads of influence the Valide had knotted. The chief eunuch became more visible and somehow less knowable. The treasury keys passed through hands that were steady but not certain. The harem's rhythm altered, by a beat at first, then by a measure, until new music wrote itself upon the old. Sas kept to her lanes, the schoolroom, the service, the unremarkable corridors where power was transported disguised as errands, yet even there, the ripples reached. One afternoon, the Kuzlar stopped in the threshold of the classroom, where Sas was coaxing letters from a child reluctant as a closed fist. He watched without speaking. The other girls straightened, and the little one froze mid-stroke, the chalk squeaking. "Continue," he said. His voice was the sound of a seal impressed into wax. Sas guided the girl's hand. The line trembled, then steadied. When the letter formed, a perfect crescent, the chief eunuch nodded once and left. Recognition is a coin too heavy for most pockets. Sas hid it well. But Ziba, whose garden had been watered daily with attention, noticed its glint. He sees you, she murmured later, fingers combing through combed silk. Careful. The palace punishes those who are seen by the wrong eyes at the wrong time. Sometimes the wrong eyes are many. Sass did not answer. They were alone on a balcony that tasted of sea and pigeons, the city unscrolling below like a manuscript too ornate to translate. Winter arrived with an honest cold that punished both marble and flesh. In the library, where the air was warmer by a decree of parchment and charcoal, Sass found a book a scribe had left in carelessness or kindness. It was a copy of Masnavi, the pages thin as onion skin. She read by tracing, underlining each line with the shadow of her finger. You were born with wings, the page told her. Why prefer to crawl through life? Because, she thought, crawling is safer where ceilings are low. Still, the word wings lodged in her throat like a promise she could not swallow. The summons came in spring, when the courtyards were dizzy with wisteria, and the fountains spoke all day to anyone who would listen. Gulsum found her in the storeroom inventorying soaps. You will serve tonight, the Kalfa said, voice neutral as a flat road. In the small salon beyond the aviary. Sass nodded, though she knew what this meant. It meant the gaze widening like a door. It meant a test. It meant the soft click of fate rearranging hinges. Ziba found her as she dressed. Sometimes, the favored girl said, fastening a clasp at Sass's shoulder. A choice is not a branch in a road, but the road itself deciding to be river. She paused as if translating herself. Float. Stones are not our business. Then Ziba kissed her cheek, a benediction or a theft, and was gone. The salon was lit as if fire had learned manners. Lamps in niches made stars of the plasterwork. There were birds in a gilt cage, a pair of bulbuls, that had forgotten flight and learned singing instead. The man who entered wore simplicity like a disguise. His robe was modest, his beard neat, his eyes the color of good soil. Sass lowered her gaze and poured sherbet as if it were time itself, steady and sweet. The small talk was not small. It was the talk people use when they are deciding which part of themselves to present as truth. Your Turkish is clean, he said, not unkindly. Your accent, Circassian? Georgian, she answered, and wondered whether the syllables would leave a bruise on the air. Georgia is a steep country, he said. Steep countries make strong legs. She did not know whether to thank him. The birds sang about summers they had not seen. What passed between them was less than rumor, and more than silence. He asked whether she read. She said she taught letters to the youngest. He said letters were ladders, and ladders needed walls to lean on. She said walls were plentiful. Then he smiled, and it was a private thing that made her feel both chosen and warned. That night she slept without dreaming. In the morning, she remembered nothing but the way the bulbuls had hopped, as if their happiness were a small, manageable animal. After that, service came in irregular tides. Some evenings she would be summoned to pour, to place, to pass, and then to vanish like a ribbon drawn through a fist. Some weeks would pass without her name appearing on any list. The uncertainty felt like standing between seasons with no cloak. Yet with each summons, her circle widened by a finger's width. The matrons learned her measured competence, the eunuchs, her reliability, the scribes, her carefulness with parchment and ink. Competence was a kind of beauty, and safer. One afternoon, while delivering a sealed note to the treasury, Sass saw Ziba emerging from the physician's rooms, a hand on her belly, a smile that tried to stay humble and could not. A rumor ripened by dusk. By dawn, it wore a crown. Ziba was with child. The palace changed the angle of its gaze. A new set of futures unfurled like prayer rugs too precious for the floor. The air around Ziba became thick with protections disguised as invitations. She walked as if carrying light. Sass's joy for Ziba was sincere and complicated. They had braided each other's hair through many seasons of uncertainty. They had shared salt and stories and silence. Yet love and survival were twin gods who rarely agreed. The palace sharpened this truth until it glittered. Sass offered prayers shaped like wishes, for Ziba's safety, for a healthy child, for the softened hearts of those whose envy might become hunger. 2 months later, the palace learned again how quickly a tide can turn. Ziba stumbled on the steps near the aviary where the bulbuls sang about joy. The world tilted, and what had been potential became peril. The physicians moved like an alphabet rearranged to spell the same futile word. By evening, the child was gone, and Ziba's beauty had learned a new expression. The palace resumed its old habit, pretending things that hurt had not happened by changing the subject. It made a theater of concern, then folded the stage away. Ziba did not fold. Her grief became something both of them could sit beside. At night, she and Sas wrapped themselves in silence and told stories they had told before, holding them longer on their tongues, as if that might make memory heavier and harder to steal. Ziba spoke of an orchard on a hill where her mother had sung among bees. Sas spoke of a river that never froze, even when winter ate the edges of the world. They spoke until the words were dry leaves and then kept speaking, because sometimes that is how you keep from going out. Spring again. The trees insisted on life. Sas watched the youngest novices copy letters with their tongues jutting out in concentration. She corrected a loop here, a tail there. She praised, she teased. She told them a letter could be a boat if they needed it to be. When they asked what kind of boat, she said, "One that doesn't sink when you cry in it." They giggled. She did not. The next shift in the palace came not as drama but as accumulation. 100 small decisions that, taken together, formed a new shape. The Sultan traveled more and returned less delighted by familiar pleasures. A certain vizier's star dimmed, another's brightened. The chief eunuch replaced a steward whose thefts had been graceful enough to pass for skill until they weren't tea. Through it all, Sas became the person people trusted to carry things that could not be dropped. Secrets were handed to her wrapped in errands, and she delivered them unopened. One such errand brought her to the outer gardens at dusk, where orange trees released their private suns into the air. She found a boy there, no more than 12, hiding badly behind a cypress. His cap was askew, his eyes red-rimmed, his jacket the sort of fine that meant he would never learn the habits of hunger. "I am not supposed to be here," he announced, which was true in more ways than one. "No one is until they are," Sas said without turning her head. "What are you doing?" "Not crying," he said, and surrendered to it. She kept her gaze on the gravel until the sobs bent themselves into breathing. "Who are you?" he asked finally, defiant again, as if that were the rope he trusted. "No one who can hurt you," she said. Sometimes this is the only truth big enough to be useful. She saw him twice more at similar hours in places where finding someone was a choice you made. The second time, he asked whether the birds in the aviary remembered the sky. "Every minute," she said. "Remembering is their revenge." The third time he did not ask. He pointed at a single bright star above the dome and said, "That one is mine. The others can be argued about." She laughed, not like a bird, but like a person who had set a heavy bucket down. Later, when she learned his name from a careless conversation between two men who assumed the walls were not listening, she folded it into her memory and pretended it had always been there. The palace believes it knows its people, but it knows only their reflections. Sas kept herself just out of reach of mirrors. Her power, such as it was, lay in the space between what she could be asked and what she could be assumed to be. She learned the precise weight of silence in a room. She knew how long to hold a gaze and when to lower it as if it had become heavy. She could carry a tray with a letter atop it, and no one would ask who it was for. They would see only the tray, years unspooled. The ember she had carried from her village did not go out. It did not become a bonfire either. It became a steady coal, useful for warming hands, not enough to burn the house. She met women who made alliances like men make maps, with an eye to borders and crossings. She met others who preferred invisibility to influence and learned not to judge either choice. She met a scholar in a side room once who taught her that grief is a dye. It stains everything, but the shade is not the same for every cloth. One night, the bulbuls were silent. Sas woke before dawn with a certainty she could not name, a new wind threading the arches. By mid-morning, whispers had found a shape. The boy with the red-rimmed eyes had become a prince with duties and dangers. The palace's geometry altered again, angles becoming edges, then smoothing to curves. Life in the harem was a series of recalibrations, a dance on a floor that shifted as if alive. Saz took her place in the pattern, neither hidden nor exposed. Ziba, whose laughter had found its way back through corridors of sorrow, returned to favor in a quieter key. Gulsum retired to a village she had never stopped sending coins to, and before she left, she pressed Saz's hands and said, "Grace is control that looks like water. I told you once. I tell you again. Be water." Saz promised. Promises are the scaffolds we build inside ourselves to reach places no one can see. On the last day of spring, the aviary door was left ajar by a servant who had not learned the palace's appetite for small mistakes. The bulbuls were old now, their wings flickered like memories of wings. Saz watched them from the far side of the courtyard. They hopped to the threshold, looked at the square of sky, then hopped back to their familiar bars. Freedom, she understood, is not the open door. It is the ability to risk what lies beyond it. That night she dreamt of the hillside where goats rattled the air with their bells, and her mother's voice could summon her from distances that did not exist on maps. When she woke, her face was wet. She did not wipe it. The tears cooled in the morning breeze and left salt that tasted like the sea she rarely saw. She rose, arranged her garments, and went to the schoolroom where a child was waiting to learn how to turn a line into a curve into a letter into a word into a door. "Again," she said gently, guiding the small hand. Again. The chalk made its soft sound against slate, the sound of small futures writing themselves. Outside, the palace rehearsed the business of power, the heavy steps and the light ones, the chess moves and the pauses that meant everything. Inside, a girl learned the shape of a leaf, straight as a promise, and lamb, bending where bending was wise, and ya, which looks back as it moves forward. Saz smiled. The ember glowed. In time they would call her reliable, a word dull to those who do not understand its shine. In time she would become a woman whose name mattered to people whose names did not matter to anyone who wrote history. In time, she would see Ziba as child lift his mother's chin from the weight of sorrow and call it air. In time she would stand again in the aviary and watch new birds choose, some to stay, some to go, and she would not decide for them in her heart. For now, there was the work of carrying, of pouring, of teaching, of not dropping what could break, of accepting what could not be fixed, of resisting without spectacle, of remembering without drowning. For now there was the harem, which others would reduce to silk and sin, and which she knew as a machine of survival powered by women's invisible labor and visible grace. For now, there was her breath, and it did not belong to anyone else as long as it remained inside her. When the evening call to prayer ribboned through the courtyards and over the sea, Saz stood at a window cut from stone that had watched more seasons than any one life could hold. She raised her hands and asked for nothing grand, only that tomorrow come gently for the girls who feared it, and that yesterday loosen its grip on those who could not put it down. She asked for Ziba's laughter to keep finding the way. She asked for the bulbuls to sing, whether of sky or of cages, as they preferred. She asked for her ember to remain itself. Outside, the city made its many sounds, the clatter of hooves, the bargaining of men, the creak and sigh of boats, the hush that followed news too large for voices. Inside, a woman who had once been a girl on a hillside placed a tray on a low table without spilling a drop and walked away. In the place she left, the sherbet caught the late light and held it, a small, stubborn sun. And in some room where a child traced a letter into sense, a door opened that no one else could see.